Colleen Stewart. I work with the New Hampshire Food Alliance. This meeting that you're attending is one of our network cafe, part of our 2022-2023 series. We use it as a place for our network to gather and have discussions and networking opportunities around different areas and issues in our food system in New Hampshire. I'm going to go through a couple housekeeping items before we dig into the meat of our agenda, but if there's any questions or things along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. You're also welcome to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling in from, your organization, maybe something you're excited about learning about today's topic. Couple housekeeping things, just a little brief thing about our organization. The New Hampshire Food Alliance, for folks who are new to this, is a statewide network coordinated by the Sustainability Institute at UNH. We engage and connect people dedicated to growing a thriving, fair, and sustainable local food system here in New Hampshire. I always want to make sure that we acknowledge the lands that the University of New Hampshire continues to steward today, and that is the lands of the Pennacook, Abenaki, and Wabanaki peoples. And I encourage you all to take a look at UNH's full land, water, and life acknowledgement and DEI statement on their website. It's really great and a nice representation of that stewardship. One last few things. I want to just run through our desired outcomes for this cafe and also point you towards our network cafe community agreements, which is linked in our agenda. Those community agreements are just a way to provide structure for all of our cafes and provide everyone an understanding of what we expect in terms of how we have conversations with one another, how we learn together and collaborate. Desired outcomes today specifically, we are hoping to establish a clear understanding of what each type of conservation organization does to protect and provide equitable access to farmland in New Hampshire. We want to draw some connections between conservation organizations and other food and ag organizations, allowing them to work better together. And we want to have a clear understanding of how and why protecting farmland is the foundation of building a climate resilient food system in New Hampshire. Okay. Is everyone has the agenda? I'm going to share it one more time just to make sure. So today we are talking about protecting farmland in New Hampshire. And the reason that this is our topic for today is because this network cafe is a part of a themed series based on our 6 ways to build a climate resilient food system framework, which is a framework that, and I'm going to share a link to that in the chat, is a framework that the New Hampshire Food Alliance and its climate action team created to articulate how our work building a strong local food system can help communities adapt and thrive as the climate changes. So we're using our Network Cafe series to really communicate better and further this framework so more people can see it and understand it and think about it, and also to breathe a little bit of life into a very static Word document. So we're hosting panels like the one today, which you'll hear from very soon, that will showcase the work that they're doing in relationship to this topic, in a way in relationship to one of the 6 ways of building a climate resilient food system. So today we're covering the first way, which is protect farmland, make it accessible to all farmers, and practice regenerative land stewardship. We're going to focus on that first part of land access and conservation because it is the foundational part of building along a strong local food system. We cannot have the second part of that way, which is regenerative agriculture, if we don't have any land to farm. So I'm going to stop talking and let our panelists share all of the great information and learnings that they have. Today, we're going to hear from Jeremy Lougee from the Southeast Land Trust. We're going to hear from Amanda Littleton from the Cheshire County Conservation District. And we're going to hear from Lisa Morin, who is representing Laconia from the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions. And in the agenda, there's some bullet points about what they're going to be speaking about individually in hopes of providing a nice landscape of what the conservation work is happening in New Hampshire. So I am going to let Jeremy kick us off. He's going to have some slides that he's going to present from, so you'll see that popping up soon. And any questions or thoughts that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat. So Jeremy, take it away.
Great. It looks like, there we go. Thank you all for coming. I'm really delighted to see how many people are showing up today. I see some familiar faces and names out there, so look forward to learning with everyone. So we can start with the first slide. So I just wanted to share, so I'm a project manager at the Southeast Land Trust. Our mission is to protect and sustain the significant lands in our communities for clean water, outdoor recreation, fresh food, wildlife, and healthy forests. And, you know, it's probably pretty obvious the connection between food security and farmland for most of you. But one of the things I like to point to often is the New England food vision, whereby New England is going to be producing 50% of the food we consume by 2060. And that's a pretty lofty goal, considering New Hampshire's already lost 90% of our farmland since the early 1920s. But I think it's attainable, and especially if we work together with our partners on either side of our borders. Next slide. So, you know, while you're protecting farmland, there's not just one benefit. There's multiple benefits, and I'll talk about this a little bit later when I mention some of the projects we've worked on. But you know, in addition to providing access to local food, there's also scenic views, rural character, protecting important wildlife habitat, and public water supply. When a farm gets developed, all of these benefits go away. And, you know, especially now, we do have somewhat of a housing crisis in New Hampshire. I want to make clear that land trusts are not anti-development. We're just about smart development and knowing where to build the houses and where to protect important farmland and wildlife habitat and places for people to recreate and enjoy a good life. Next slide. So I just want to point out a lot of the really great work that American Farmland Trust has done. They have their Farms Under Threat series, and they really dug into the data to sort of show what everyone probably feels as they grow up in New Hampshire and see farms get developed. But just since 2001 to 2016, we've lost over 11,000 acres of farmland. With prime farmland being the greatest loss. That's the most productive soils we have. So it's really happening at a rapid rate. 11,600 acres, just as a frame of reference, can generate up to $5.1 million worth of revenue a year. So it's not just losing farmland and the ability to produce food, but it is an economic driver as well, provides lots of local jobs. The other thing to think about and to mention is the fact that we're also losing a lot of our farmers. The vast majority of our farmers, 5 times more in fact, are over the age of 65 than are under the age of 35. So we're just not replacing the farmers as they retire or move away from farming. Next slide. So, who's out there working on farmland protection specifically? Obviously, land trusts. There are lots of organizations like the New Hampshire Food Alliance and Land for Good that are working on this. Conservation commissions protect their own local farmland, and agricultural commissions support it. Cooperative Extension, Department of Agriculture, Farm Bureau. There are lots of organizations thinking about this. There are also lots of organizations that are bringing funding to the table because that's what it really takes to protect farmland. The Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a part of U.S. Department of Agriculture, brings the lion's share of farmland funding to our state. Towns have conservation funds that we often use. If you've heard of LCHIP, the Land and Community Heritage Investment Program, we often use those funds. And towns sometimes just decide to vote on their own through town meeting and a warrant article that they want to put money towards protecting farmland. And then we also bring a lot of money towards it through private foundations or fundraising through social media. Next slide. So I'm just going to use Bodwell Dairy Farm in Kensington, New Hampshire as an example. This is one of my favorite projects. The Bodwells are amazing people, been farming there since the early 1900s. You can go to the next slide. And so this is a farm, a little over 300 acres. We actually protected it in two phases. We did the southern half of the farm as a first phase, and then the northern half of the farm as a second. And, you know, this is a perfect example again of we protected a lot of prime and statewide important farmland, but in addition to that, the town gets these beautiful scenic views. This is a farm that's in a really rural location. The wildlife habitat is top tier. All of the water that drains from this farm flows into the Exeter River, which is used as a public water supply for the town of Exeter. And it's also a conservation focus area for those of you that know the New Hampshire Coastal Plan. So we can go to the next slide. There are lots of good reasons to protect this farm besides just the agriculture itself. So this is what we call a conceptual development plan, and it's something that we actually had to do to figure out what the value of the conservation easement was. But essentially what it showed was this is just the north side of the farm. It could have been divvied up into 49 house lots based on the current zoning ordinance. So again, you sort of have to think about this. This is a really rural location. It's nowhere near schools, businesses, or any services really. So is this the location that we want to pop in a big long cul-de-sac and 49 houses, or does it make more sense to put those houses in a location that's more proximal to all those services and businesses that they'd be using? Next slide. So funding, I already mentioned this a little bit, but where it comes from, for the Bodwell project, we actually had to pull funding from 8 different sources. This is essentially the list, in addition to some private donations that we attracted, but a lot of those are probably familiar to some of you folks. But this is I cover Rockingham and Stratford counties, and these are really typical funding sources, although the Russell Farm and Forest Foundation is no longer active. Next slide. So this is one of my favorite pictures. We had the Portsmouth Elementary School come out and visit the Bodwell Dairy Farm while we were protecting it. And, you know, I grew up on a small dairy farm in New Hampshire. I had a lot of friends who grew up on dairy farms. A good number of these kids had actually never seen a cow in person. They were shocked. I mean, you can see them. They were practically crawling over the fence. And so to think about that, you know, growing up in Portsmouth, to have never seen a cow, we really need to find ways to connect the people in New Hampshire back to the farms that are producing their food. And I think, you know, that will go a long way towards the support we need and the funding we need, frankly, to conserve the rest of our farmland. Next slide. So, you know, when land trusts first got started conserving land, there weren't a lot of them that were focused on farmland. It was seen as more of an intensive use of the land. But over time, I think land trusts have really come around and realized that there's just such a myriad of benefits to protecting farmland. But it's really important because, you know, the land trust holds the conservation easement, is going to make sure that all of the rules and restrictions of the conservation easement are upheld. So it's really important to make sure that at the start of protecting farms, that the land trust and the farmers kind of have a common set of goals and expectations, and that they talk about that throughout the process. Next slide. And like that, you know, farms are busy places. You know, some farms are busier than others. A commercial dairy farm in particular, there's, you know, heavy machinery, there's milk trucks backing in and out. So it's a busy, messy place. So it's not what you might think of when you typically think of land conservation and rural landscapes, but that's, you know, that's how food is made. And so it's really important that land trusts and other organizations understand that when you protect a farm, you're protecting, you know, more than just the land. You're protecting the ability to run a farm business there. Next slide. So, you know, one of the things that we're going to talk about, I think, today is about access to farmland and making sure that's equitable and viable over the long term. And one thing I'd encourage, if any of you are from towns or other land trusts, if you have farmland that you own, I really want you to think about ways that you can get that in the hands of farmers and really think about making sure that the farm business is front and center, and that as you lease the farm or you know, make rules around that farmland, that you make sure that the farmer can sustain a business there. Think about a longer term lease. In some cases, leases can turn into ownership over time, and that's the best scenario. But, you know, providing that access to farmland ultimately will allow these farmers to bring more local food to our stores. Next slide. So one of the examples that we have, we were able to work with the 2 young farmers at Clyde Farm who were operating down in Brentwood on leased farmland. They've been operating, I think, around 5 years. And we were working with a family up in Farmington that was an old dairy farm. They weren't farming anymore, and they just wanted to know that there weren't going to be houses on the dairy farm, essentially. So knowing that Jimmy and Kristen here, and Clyde is the dog, knowing that they were really looking for farmland, we were able to connect the 2 of them when we did the conservation easement. And so it became an affordable way for Jimmy and Kristen to purchase the land while also achieving the landowner's goal of seeing that land protected. Next slide. So some of the things that land trusts are doing, and we haven't typically done them, but we're sort of evolving over time, is really starting to think about, you know, farmland viability, affordability, and productivity. We want the farms we protect to be producing food and not just to be, you know, sold to someone that's going to mow it once a year and not grow food on it. We really want to see that land productive. So some of the ways we've been able to do that, and also one of the bigger challenges is the affordability of farmland, particularly I'm sure in many regions of New Hampshire, but particularly on the seacoast. You know, a 20-acre farm, maybe $1 million, and that is not a price that a farmer can afford to pay and then still be able to make a profit farming. So really have to think about ways to keep that farmland affordable. Something that you may hear in the future is called an option to purchase at agricultural value, and that just keeps the farmland being bought and sold between farmers. And if the current landowner can't find a farmer to sell it to, then it gives the land trust the ability to step in, purchase that land, and then direct it to a farmer themselves. So I think that's my last slide. And I think that's a good segue too into what Amanda's going to be talking about. And I think we'll probably hold questions till Amanda and Lisa get through their slides.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy. I do acknowledge that Eric had a question in the chat, and we will make sure to get to that before we get to our second half of the cafe. But yeah, Amanda, please take it away. Caitlin will share your slides.
Great, thanks, Colleen. Thank you, Jeremy. My name is Amanda Littleton. I work with the Cheshire County Conservation District, but I'm here to share with you about a statewide program that's in partnership with all of the other 9 county conservation districts as well. So it's the New Hampshire Farm Future Fund. And so what is this program? Well, it was to really help complement what's happening with conservation easements on agricultural land that Jeremy's been talking about. And it has a mission to provide funding for farm viability planning in concert with putting in conservation easement, in conserving those important agricultural soils. So what we're trying to do here with this program is really leverage the opportunity of when that land is conserved to really invest in the future of the farm business. So you may be thinking, all right, what does that investment look like? Well, it depends on the life cycle of the farmer. Say if it's a young farm family, they may be looking at investing in sort of how do we build our business in a strong way? How do we diversify who we're selling to, looking at marketing, looking at enterprise, different enterprises that they have on the farm. But perhaps it's an older farming couple, and they are looking at, all right, well, how are we going to get this in the hand, looking at succession, how are we going to get it in the hands of the next generation of farmers? And so depending on where farmers are in this life cycle, this program is really catered to sort of help them make those investments. So what we want to see is that the farmland is conserved and productive and available for future generations. We're really trying to have an integrated approach to help working lands stay in active agriculture and not just become sort of that mowed once a year land, like Jeremy had mentioned. All right, we can switch sides. So this is a relatively new program. It started in 2020, and just thought I'd give a little background of sort of how it got started. Basically, it was built on years of work of many partners in agriculture and conservation. And just want to give a little shout out to the Ammonoosuc Conservation Trust, who had a USDA grant, and they worked with the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund and others to really sort of pilot, working with some farms in Grafton County, New Hampshire, to see like, all right, how do we pair this business planning, farm viability planning, alongside conservation and stewardship and agricultural production? And so it's looking at that centerpiece, like where's the innovation where we can overlap all of these. So there's some good lessons learned from this pilot. Basically, that there's a big gap in funding for succession and land transfer planning. There's also a gap in helping land trusts with that pre-work before the easement happens, helping to support lower capacity land trusts who might not be doing a lot of farmland protection in the state. And we really need to make sure that whatever funding we're putting towards this matches the timelines and the needs of the farmer as well as the land trust. So we can go to the next slide. So these were all really important lessons learned from this pilot. So when the New Hampshire Food Alliance Land Resources Action Team identified that the priority for the state in this sector was really getting additional funding to be able to help improve land access and improve conservation, we took these lessons learned from the pilot. And the county conservation districts were able to seek funding and create a program with a lot of input from the land trust staff and community throughout the state of New Hampshire to make sure it was being developed in a way that really met the needs of both farmers and the land trust. So we created this New Hampshire Farm Future Fund as through the Food Alliance's Land Resource Action Team. And it's really a grant that goes directly to farmers and land trusts. And the grant funds, it's not a huge grant, it's about $20,000, $10,000 of which goes to the land trust to be able to help them move that easement forward and make that happen for the farm. But the other $10,000 is that flexible money that helps the farmers invest where they need it on the technical assistance side. So helping with land access, helping with succession planning. Excuse me, next slide, please. Just want to talk a little bit about the partnerships with this. So the county conservation districts help administer it, but it's really a big team effort. The New Hampshire Community Loan Fund and Land for Good are key partners in this to be able to help provide that technical assistance to farmers, as well as this funding can also go to help them with legal assistance, looking at leases, making sure that they're strong so that they continue to have good land tenure into the future. And we really are dependent on our partnerships with I put in the Land Trust Coalition here because we're working with many individual land trusts throughout the state. And our funders for the program is primarily through the You Have Our Trust Fund, but also through the Charitable Foundation through the Madison Fund. And ideally, we're looking at this holistic program. We're trying to wrap around farmer needs and help them feel really supported through the easement process. So you're probably wondering what has happened so far to date. All right, we can go to the next slide. Basically, we've had 3 grant rounds, 2020 through 2022, once a year. So far, we've been able to help assist 13 farms in 7 different counties in New Hampshire, work with 8 different land trusts and the acreage overall was 1,190 acres. So looking at to be conserved. I'll just share that we will be doing this again for the next few years. Our application period in 2023 is going to be announced soon, and we're looking at having a couple different batching dates in 2023 and possibly having it be rolling applications based on what we're hearing from farm and land trust needs. All right, so the next slide, please. I do just want to share that basically, what we're talking about here with farmland protection is conservation, but there's also another side to conservation, and it's stewardship of the land that we are talking about. So once that land is conserved, we want to see it be active in agriculture with viable businesses with strong land tenure. But we also want to make sure that those farm businesses are resilient to this changing climate that we have. So how do we help these farmers adapt and mitigate to the droughts that we're seeing, to these extreme weather events, to the enhanced pest pressures? There's so many challenges that are coming on to land management with climate change. And so we're very excited that the 10 county conservation districts are starting a new grant program this year to help invest in that with farmers, a direct grant program right to farms to be able to help them adapt and mitigate. And that's something that we're going to be talking a little bit in the breakout session. So I'm going to leave it at that, but look forward to talking more with you about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was awesome. Okay, we're going to round out our panelist time with Lisa Morin. So Lisa, I don't think you have any slides, but you're going to guide us through some really exciting stuff about conservation commissions.
Yes, thank you. So what I did do is just do a little bit of, I'm going to post in the chat some information as I go. Let's see if this works. So as Colleen said, my name is Lisa Morin, and I am actually with the Belknap County Conservation District, but I have been with the Laconia Conservation Commission for over 10 years, and I am a board member on the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions Board of Directors. The New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions, abbreviated NHACC, has a mission to foster conservation and appropriate use of New Hampshire's natural resources by providing assistance to conservation commissions, facilitating communication and cooperation among commissions, and helping to create a climate in which commissions can be successful. And I took the time to read that to you because I think, when I was looking over part of the goals for this presentation and our breakout session is that, we're talking about how do we engage landowners, as kind of the grassroots up, while Jeremy and Amanda were talking about very pointed programs. Conservation commissions, there's 217 of them in the state of New Hampshire, and they can be as different as each town, and the volunteers are appointed usually by their selectmen or city councils, and often who gets appointed there's a reflection of the people who are appointing them, so that can come into play. So the NHACC is doing outreach through a lunch and learn series, and they've just redone their website, and they have like a resources page. It's got about 8 different resource tabs, although they're not traditional. As you look across the top of the website, that's not where they are. They're in folders. And they're highly advisory on a lot of boards. They sit on the State Conservation Committee. They sit on cooperative extension boards. They work with, I think they were even, Barbara Richter, as the executive director, was even involved in the Wildlife Action Management Plan. So they are in a lot of arenas. So the role of conservation commissions, they're all volunteer. They are advisory only. So, I mean, I'm sure looking at, I took a minute to see who was here, and I think some of you probably are very familiar with commissions and some may not be, so please bear with me. They I am most familiar with the setup of where we are advisory to the planning commission, the planning board. A developer will come to us with a plan, an idea, sometimes very mapped out. It'll be someone they've hired to present their plans, and we advise them. And it's usually on watershed basis. What we're concerned with is soils, water, and agriculture, depending on the town, may or may not really come into play for a lot of conservation commissions. And I think, to Jeremy's point, that's why the land trusts have kind of come around to realizing that there's a place for them to do that. So they are conservation commissions are protecting critical habitats, water resources, natural areas. They do outreach, and they manage sometimes town lands, town forest for timber, recreation, or wildlife. There are some things, they exist because of a state RSA, and there are some things they're charged that they must do. And they must conduct research on local lands for features, water features, important features of wildlife. That's why we talked about the Wildlife Action Plan. They very often have a natural resources inventory. If they don't pay for that, they do in some way index, what they're calling index their resources. They coordinate activities and convene like-minded unofficial organizations. For instance, I belong to several grassroots organizations. They're not 501c3s. They have concerns for different resources, and they will often come to the commission and use the commission as a rallying point, allow the Conservation Commission in the town to gather like-minded people together to bring this forward as a concern for the town. And they have to keep records of their meetings and their actions. Now, they have some activities that they can do. They're not required to do them, but they often can do. They can accept gifts and funding, donations, and property. And they can publish materials. I talked with the town of Sammerton, and here's kind of this grassroots. Amanda Grapponi-Omer from Grapponi Auto moved to Sammerton, loves to run. She was running through the town, like, this is really beautiful. She went to the Conservation Commission, and they set up this large funding source for the Conservation Commission, like a conservation trust fund, simply because she moved there and loved the town. But she went to the Conservation Commission, and so they were able to accept that gift of money. They are builders of community support, and because they have this local focus, they know all the people in town. Usually, because there's usually 5 Conservation Commission members. There may be, that number can vary, but they know everybody. And one of the things when I was talking to several of the Conservation Commission members in Belknap County, which is where I'm from, the chair of the Alton Conservation Commission says we don't only have farmland, but the land that we're conserving, if we use taxpayer money, the taxpayer wants to see something from that. They want something tangible from that, if it's like public access, or in Rye, New Hampshire, the Goss Farm. It's a long process. I talked to the Rockingham County Conservation District, but the ultimate result of all the work that was done to conserve the Goss Farm is that it is a public entity now. It was sold to the town. And they let's see, the other thing that wasn't in the write-up, and I hope you don't mind if I mention it, Colleen, is agricultural commissions. I know Jeremy mentioned them. And the New Hampshire Food Alliance had a network cafe strictly on conservation, agricultural commissions in 2021, and there's a video, so you could go to their website and watch this video. They operate much the same as a conservation commission in the fact that they're advisory, but they have a much more specific focus for agriculture. How Laconia decided to handle that was they didn't want to create an agricultural commission. They felt it was another level of bureaucracy that we didn't need because we don't have that many active farms as people think of farms. There's a lot of niche farmers, people doing small amounts of farming. But what they did was they created a subcommittee within the Conservation Commission to address agriculture. The New Hampshire Office of Strategic Initiatives has a lot of information on agricultural commissions and broken out in a very clear, concise outline. So I'm going to stop there unless somebody has a reason to call me back to something I said, or.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. We have like 1 or 2 minutes for questions. I really want to get us into our breakout rooms. I want to lift up Eric's question from earlier, which I think is for Jeremy. In what ways do easement terms impact lease duration for farmers working on conserved land, flexibly and or rigidly?
Yeah, I would say most of the farmland easements that I'm familiar with don't really place a lot of restrictions around leasing. They usually allow it. In fact, I think it's a good thing, as much flexibility as can be built into farmland easements, I think the better. And when it comes to leasing, there's usually a good reason for a lease, and it probably means that the farmland is going to stay in production. So that's something I think most land trusts support. I actually haven't seen a conservation easement with a restriction around a lease. Not to say it's not out there, but.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jeremy. And yes, Eric's thanking you in the chat. Jean Jonas had a question. Access to farmland is a huge barrier for entrance into farming. Is it possible for town-owned land to be made available for agricultural use where it makes sense to do so? He notes that he spoke with the Conservation Commission in Mason, and the answer he got was yes. So any one of our presenters can chime in there.
Lisa, do you have some land in Laconia that's leased?
So, yeah, the Belknap County Conservation District is working with, it's Dancer, it used to be Dread. We have a management agreement for agriculture and wildlife on 48 acres. And we then have subleased, or if you want to call it that, a contract with the small beginner farmers to hay that. And we also run community gardens on that. The small amount of forest land is not being productively harvested or managed really, and that is another opportunity we could do. So our agreement runs out in 2032, and there are several other parcels of state land that I believe are being hayed under different agreements.
Great, thank you. Jean can let us know in the chat if that answers his question. Okay, great. So moving on to our next portion, thank you to our panel presenters for all that great information and some framing for what we're going to talk about together in breakout rooms. You'll see in the agenda, which I'll share again in the chat for everyone. You'll see there are going to be 3 different rooms, and Jeremy, Amanda, and Lisa are going to be the hosts of each of those rooms. And the topic at hand is conservation challenges. So each of them have identified different challenges that they face in their work, in their different organizations. Group 1 is going to be Lisa's group, which is meeting landowners where they are. Group 2 is going to be with Jeremy, and that is land is protected. Is it productive and sustainable over the long term? And group 3 is going to be natural resources stewardship for future farm viability with Amanda. So there is a notes document that is down towards the bottom of the chat where hopefully someone in each group will volunteer to take notes. And there's some questions at the top of each of those documents that you can use as a frame for your conversation. So feel free to use this time to ask some clarifying questions if you have them to your group leaders. To network about your work in terms of how it may coincide and align with the work of these different organizations and conservation in general, and just again use this time to get to know one another and connect about how we can continue to conserve our land in New Hampshire, our ag land. So I'm going to open the rooms, and you should be available to pick them. So go ahead and pick them. If you need help getting assigned a room, please let me know. And we'll try to have 15 or so minutes in our groups. So enjoy your conversations. All right, welcome back, everyone. Let's see, I think everyone's getting zoomed back into the main room here. All right, I hope you had great conversations in your groups. I'm excited to look at any notes or hear from Amanda and Jeremy and Lisa a little bit about what you talked about. So we'll have them do a quick group harvest of what you all talked about, and then we'll do some housekeeping items for the end of our time together, and then we'll send you back into your afternoons. So let's do group one was Lisa. So Lisa, you want to do a quick just takeaways from your group?
I'm gonna pass it off to Lisa Wise, if you don't mind, Lisa, if I put you on, because
Sure.
she did the notes for us.
All right.
If that's
perfect.
okay.
Yeah, sure. So I did get some notes down in the Google Doc, but we talked about a lot of different hurdles that can come up for landowners, from navigating family dynamics to accessing funding and juggling various funding sources, just getting through the planning process, which can have many different aspects and can take a long time. And folks did share a couple of resources that can help with some of these challenges, like the UNH Extension Farmer and Rancher Stress Assistance Program, which can provide funds for legal and accounting expenses. The Legal Food Hub, which can provide free legal services. So I think those were a couple of the resources that were shared that might be helpful for folks. I can put the links in the full group chat here too.
Great. Thank you.
And
Lisa.
I'm afraid, Colleen, I spoke to them rather than let them network too much. So that's my bad.
That's
there.
okay. That's okay. Group two, Jeremy.
Yeah, John, do you want to take this or would you like me to?
Sure. So I guess basically the conversation was around how to make farming affordable. There's so much price pressure on land now in New Hampshire, especially in the seacoast. And so lots of farmers are, tempted to just sell off the land to developers or whatever. And so how do we make that affordable? So one thing Jeremy talked about is this tool he mentioned about when the trust is able to conserve land, they put in this tool about that requires the farmer, if they can't or don't want to sell to a farmer, to sell it back to the land trust at agricultural value so that they can then find a farmer to farm it, to purchase it and farm it. There was a mention of educational and community models of farming, and we didn't get too much into what that means, but I think the idea was get people farming and bring other things together around the farm so that it's not just dependent on farm income. Did I get that right, Julian?
Yeah, more or less. It was just what I'm exploring now and interested in. So
yeah. And I guess the third thing was I brought up the model used by the Agrarian Trust, which is a national farmland trust, but they're actually the executive directors in New Hampshire, Ian McSweeney, and they have a model of conservation that's sort of bringing back the idea of the commons. And so the land is held in common, and then but required to be used agriculturally, and the commons then has a long-term lease with the farmer that gives them long-term land security at an affordable price and allows them to makes it more viable for them.
Great. Thank you for sharing that, John. And then Amanda, really quick before we sign off.
We just started getting past introductions and into sharing information, and education is a role of the New Hampshire Food Alliance as an important one, ensuring that we're aware of what's happening with the Inflation Reduction Act and how that's supporting Farm Bill and other new programs, making adjustments there. Looking at the state funding for conservation easements also came up. How do we support the New Hampshire Department of Agriculture to ensure that those are being utilized and more funds are being requested at the state level into the future? And just really just comments on supporting the need for more new farmers an
Mm.
estate, as well as supporting conservation of existing farmland. So I'll leave it at that.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, Amanda. All right. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate you all so much for joining for this conversation. We'll have some follow-up of the recording, any notes, any links and resources that were shared. I also encourage you all to take our Network Cafe evaluation so we can continue to make this time together really helpful and useful to you all. I just put that link in the chat and I will follow up with it in an email as well. Next, coming up, our next Network Cafe is going to be again on this 6 ways to build a climate resilient food system with a specific theme and presentation of supporting our local farm, fish, and food businesses with the New England Young Fishermen's Alliance. So I hope you all will join us for that. If you have any specific questions, you're more than welcome to follow up with me personally. I'll put my email in the chat, and I thank you all for such a great discussion and have a great weekend.